That day remains one of the most surreal and exhilarating of my life. It began a few months prior. The house was eerily silent, a stillness that permeated the very walls. I'd just returned from a grueling workday, the kind where time drags and all you crave is the oblivion of sleep. My feet throbbed, my head swam, and the image of my pillow was the only thing propelling me forward. I tossed my keys onto the counter, kicked off my shoes, and exhaled deeply. But as I walked down the hall, something caught my eye. A sliver of light emanated from under the guest room door. Uncle Mark. I'd completely forgotten he was supposed to stay with us. He'd mentioned earlier in the week he might drop by, but I hadn't anticipated his arrival today. My uncle was a restless soul, constantly on the move. He possessed a certain charisma, a ready smile and a booming laugh, yet there was an undeniable magnetism about him, something that made people take a second look. Maybe it was his self-assuredness, the way he carried himself. Whatever it was, Uncle Mark exuded an energy that was difficult to ignore. I hesitated in the hallway, debating whether to knock and see if he was awake or just head straight to bed. Curiosity won. The light under the door was faint, suggesting only the bedside lamp was on, perhaps indicating he was already asleep. I decided to just peek in, ensure everything was all right, and then retreat to my room. I pushed the door open cautiously, the soft creak of the hinges seeming amplified in the quiet house. Uncle Mark didn't stir. I stepped inside, the lamp casting a warm glow across the room. There he was, sprawled on the bed, one arm flung across his chest. I froze, my heart pounding, my breath catching in my throat. Uncle Mark's shirt was untucked, riding up slightly to reveal a glimpse of his toned stomach. His jeans sat low on his hips, but it wasn't just that. His hand rested casually on his thigh, and as my eyes drifted lower, my breath hitched. He was asleep, evident from the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, but his jeans were unzipped, halfway down, the top of his boxers visible. His shirt was open at the collar, exposing his collarbone, and there, revealed in the soft light, was an undeniable bulge pressing against the fabric of his boxers. I should have averted my gaze. I should have turned and left, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. I'd never viewed my uncle in this light before, but suddenly I found him incredibly attractive. The sight of him so relaxed, so unguarded, stirred something within me that I couldn't comprehend, but also couldn't dismiss. I took a step closer, my movements slow, almost hesitant. Uncle Mark's face was turned to the side, his expression peaceful, oblivious to my presence. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, but the closer I got, the stronger the pull I felt towards him. What was I doing? The rational part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to walk away, but it was overwhelmed by a strange mix of curiosity and desire. I had never considered Uncle Mark like this before. He was family. This was wrong. But the way the light played on his skin, the way his body lay so comfortably on the bed, I couldn't look away. I knelt beside the bed, my hands trembling as I reached out, my fingertips brushing lightly against the exposed skin of his stomach. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt through me. I held my breath, expecting him to wake, but he didn't move. Emboldened, I let my hand move higher, my fingers trailing up toward his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. What was I doing? This was madness, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I leaned closer, the faint scent of his cologne filling the air between us. My gaze moved to his face, tracing the strong lines of his jaw, the slight stubble that darkened his cheeks. He looked so serene, so at peace, entirely unaware of what was transpiring. "Uncle Mark," I whispered, my voice barely a breath in the quiet room. He didn't respond, his breathing steady, his lips slightly parted in sleep. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and before I could stop myself, I pressed a soft kiss to his hand, just where my fingers had been moments before. His skin was warm beneath my lips, the touch sending another shiver through me. My heart raced, my mind a whirlwind. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. My lips trailed up his arm, placing soft kisses along the way, each one more daring than the last. His skin was smooth and warm, his cologne intoxicating. My pulse quickened, heat rising in my chest as I leaned closer, my breath ghosting over his neck. He stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips, and I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Terror gripped me. I was certain he would wake up, open his eyes, and see me like this. So close, too close. But after a moment he sighed, his body relaxing again. I exhaled shakily, relief washing over me. I should have stopped. I should have gotten up and left before things escalated, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the moment, caught in the strange, overwhelming need that had taken hold. But the story didn't end there. I should have left the room. That thought echoed in my mind, but my body refused to obey. I was too close now, too deep into the moment to turn back. Every rational part of me screamed to get out, to leave before things went too far, but something deeper, something primal, held me there. My fingers lingered on Uncle Mark's arm, tracing a path along the toned muscle. I could feel his pulse beneath my touch, steady and strong, and it made my own heart race faster. He shifted again, and my breath caught, but he still didn't wake. I hesitated, my hand hovering just above his chest, my thoughts a chaotic mix of confusion and desire. What was I doing? This was wrong on so many levels, yet the pull between us was undeniable, even if he wasn't conscious of it. Uncle Mark sighed softly in his sleep, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. I bit my lip, my eyes drifting down to the waistband of his jeans, still slightly undone. I wasn't sure if it was intentional, or if it had just happened while he slept. But the sight of him like this, so exposed, sent a rush of heat through me. My fingers moved almost of their own accord, lightly brushing against the fabric of his jeans where the zipper had come undone. The material was soft under my touch, and I could feel the warmth of his skin beneath. My heart pounded as I traced my fingers along the edge of his jeans, just above the waistband of his boxers. I glanced up at his face, half expecting him to wake up, to catch me in the act, but his eyes remained closed, his breathing slow and even. He was still asleep, blissfully unaware of what I was doing, and yet, the way his body responded to my touch, his slight shifts, the soft sounds he made, it felt like he was aware on some level, like he was waiting for this just as much as I was. I leaned in closer, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The room felt warmer, the air thicker, and I could barely think straight as my fingers brushed against the waistband of his boxers. I hesitated again, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my body ignored the warnings. "Uncle Mark," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. He stirred again, his lips parting slightly, but he didn't wake. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and slowly, carefully, I let my fingers slip beneath the waistband of his boxers. The heat of his skin against my fingers sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was wrong, I knew that. But the way his body reacted to my touch, the way his chest rose and fell in time with mine, made it impossible to stop. There was something magnetic about this moment, something that drew me closer, even though every instinct told me to run. My hand lingered there for a moment, just beneath the waistband, feeling the warmth of his skin. I could feel the steady thrum of his pulse, and the closeness between us felt more intense than ever before. I knew I should pull away, but I couldn't. My fingers inched lower, brushing against the edge of his boxers, the thin fabric doing little to hide the hardness beneath. My heart raced, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. But before I could stop myself, I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the bare skin just above his waistband. His scent filled my senses, the faint hint of cologne mixed with something warm and familiar, and it made my head spin. That's when he started. After a couple of seconds, he stirred again, this time more noticeably. His body shifted beneath me, a low murmur escaping his lips. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment I thought he was going to wake up, that he was going to open his eyes and see me there, caught in the act. Panic flared inside me, but before I could pull away, his hand moved. His fingers brushed against my arm. Just a light touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I stared at him, my breath coming in shallow bursts as his hand slid higher, up to my shoulder. His touch was gentle but firm. His eyes fluttered open, and I felt my stomach drop. There was a brief moment of confusion in his gaze, like he was trying to piece together what was happening. But then his eyes locked onto mine, and I saw the shift. "Eli," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep but tinged with something darker, something more dangerous. His hand slid up to cup the back of my neck, pulling me closer. "What are you doing?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was caught, frozen in place by the intensity of his gaze, by the way his hand tightened slightly against my skin. My mind was... He yelled at me to apologize, to get up and leave, but I was paralyzed. I was stuck in that moment, captivated by the way his eyes darkened as they flicked down to where my hand still rested. "Do you know what you're doing to me?" He breathed, his voice low and husky, his hand gliding down to settle on my waist. His grip was firm, yet not forceful. There was a tension in his tone that quickened my pulse, a blend of frustration and longing that sent shivers down my spine. I stammered, my face burning with shame. I should have moved away. I should have apologized. But the words caught in my throat. I was too close, too consumed by the moment to think straight. Uncle Mark's hold on my waist tightened, drawing me nearer until our bodies were practically flush against one another. "You don't have to stop," he murmured, his voice soft yet insistent. "If this is what you want, you don't have to stop." My heart pounded against my ribs. The internal conflict was overwhelming, a tumultuous mix of fear, desire, and utter bewilderment. I knew this was wrong, knew we shouldn't be doing this. But the way he looked at me, the way his fingers grazed my skin, made rational thought impossible. I swallowed, forcing my eyes to meet his. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I don't know what I want." Uncle Mark's gaze softened a fraction, but the charged energy between us remained. "I think you do," he said quietly, his hand rising to caress my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "You just need to let yourself feel it." His words resonated within me, echoing through my thoughts, shattering what little control I had left. You just need to let yourself feel it. I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. Was it desire? Fear? Or something even more complex that I couldn't quite grasp? All I knew was that I was frozen, my body, my mind, everything paralyzed under the weight of his gaze. He stirred again, his lips parting slightly, but he didn't wake. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and slowly, cautiously, slipped my fingers beneath the waistband of his boxers. The heat of his skin against my fingertips sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath hitch. This was wrong, I knew it, but the way his body reacted to my touch, the way his chest rose and fell in sync with mine, made it impossible to stop. There was something magnetic about this moment, something that pulled me closer even as every instinct screamed at me to run. My hand lingered for a moment, just beneath the waistband, feeling the warmth of his skin. I could feel the steady thrum of his pulse, and the proximity between us felt more intense than ever before. I knew I should pull away, but I couldn't. My fingers inched lower, brushing against the edge of his boxers, the thin fabric offering little barrier to the hardness beneath. My heart raced, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Before I could stop myself, I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to the bare skin just above his waistband. His scent filled my senses, the faintest hint of cologne mixed with something warm and familiar, and it made my head spin. That's when he started to stir again, this time more noticeably. His body shifted beneath me, a low murmur escaping his lips, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment I thought he was going to wake up, that he would open his eyes and see me there, caught in the act. Panic flared inside me, but before I could pull away, his hand moved. His fingers brushed against my arm, just a light touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I stared at him, my breath coming in shallow bursts as his hand slid higher, up to my shoulder. His touch was gentle but firm. His eyes fluttered open, and I felt my stomach drop. There was a brief moment of confusion in his gaze, like he was trying to piece together what was happening, but then his eyes locked onto mine and I saw the shift. "Eli," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep but tinged with something darker, something more dangerous. His hand slid up to cup the back of my neck, pulling me closer. "What are you doing?" I swallowed, my throat tight, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was caught, frozen in place by the intensity of his gaze, by the way his hand tightened slightly against my skin. My mind screamed at me to apologize, to get up and leave the room, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in the moment, trapped by the way his eyes darkened as they flicked down to where my hand still rested. It was impossible to think straight. I swallowed hard, my eyes flicking up to meet his. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know what I want." Uncle Mark's expression softened a fraction, but the charged atmosphere between us remained. "I think you do," he said softly, his hand rising to cup my cheek, his thumb gently caressing my skin. "You just need to allow yourself to feel it." His words resonated within me, echoing through my thoughts, shattering what little control I had left. You just need to allow yourself to feel it. I wasn't sure what I felt anymore. Was it desire, fear, or something even more complex that I couldn't quite grasp? All I knew was that I was paralyzed, my mind and body frozen beneath his gaze. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb tracing a slow pattern across my skin, and every nerve ending tingled beneath his touch. I wanted to pull away, to say something to break the spell, but I couldn't. I sat there, my breath shallow, my heart pounding, waiting for his next move. His other hand moved down from my waist to my thigh, his fingers lightly brushing the fabric of my pants. The touch was feather-light, hesitant, yet it sent a jolt of heat through me that I couldn't ignore. I bit my lip, struggling to contain the surge of emotions threatening to consume me. Uncle Mark's eyes never left mine, the intensity in them escalating with each passing moment. "Eli," he murmured, his voice a low whisper that filled the air between us. "You don't have to be scared." I swallowed, my throat constricted. Scared didn't even begin to cover it. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I was drawn to him, to the way his hands felt on me, to the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. It was intoxicating, dangerous, and utterly impossible to resist. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, the words barely audible, feeling small and insufficient to express the turmoil within me. Uncle Mark's hand moved to the back of my neck, drawing me infinitesimally closer. His breath was warm against my skin, and the proximity made my heart race even faster. "You don't have to do anything," he whispered, his lips brushing against my ear. "Just let me take care of you." My heart skipped a beat at his words, and for a fleeting second I considered pulling away, ending this before it escalated further. But before I could act, his hand moved higher, grazing the side of my face, tilting my head towards him. His lips were so close now, a mere breath away, and I could feel the heat emanating from him, drawing me in like a magnet. I closed my eyes, my heart hammering in my chest. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but the desire building inside me, the way my body responded to his touch, was too powerful to deny. I felt the warmth of his breath on my lips, and it was as if the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of us trapped in this precarious, inevitable moment. And then, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. The kiss started softly, tentatively, as if we were both testing the waters, uncertain of what would follow. But it didn't remain gentle for long. The moment our lips connected, Something shifted between us, something dark and all-consuming. Uncle Mark's hand tightened on the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. His lips moved against mine with a hunger that caught me off guard. I gasped softly, my hands instinctively gripping his shirt as he drew me closer, his body warm and firm against mine. The kiss was overwhelming, consuming, and I felt the tension between us escalating with every passing second, like an uncontrolled fire. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away before it was too late, but my body had a will of its own. Uncle Mark's hands were everywhere, on my waist, my back, my arms, pulling me closer, his touch igniting sparks of heat within me. I could feel the hardness of his body pressed against mine, and it made my pulse quicken, the desire within me impossible to ignore. "Eli," he whispered against my lips, his voice raspy with need. "I've wanted this for so long." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Wanted this. I couldn't comprehend the idea that he had been thinking about me this way, that this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing. He had wanted me, and now that we were here, it was clear he wasn't going to stop unless I asked him to. But I didn't want to stop. I leaned into the kiss, my hands sliding up to his shoulders, pulling him even closer. I could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles tightened beneath my touch, and it intensified my own desire. His lips moved against mine with a desperate urgency, as if he had been holding back for too long, and now that he had crossed this line, there was no turning back. Uncle Mark's hands slid down to my hips, gripping me tightly as he pulled me onto the bed beside him. The movement was swift, almost fluid, and before I knew it, I was lying next to him, his body pressed against mine, the heat between us intensifying. He kissed me again, harder this time, his hands roaming over my body with a hunger that made my head spin. My heart pounded, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions I couldn't control. This was happening. It was real. And no matter how wrong it felt, no matter how much I knew we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross, I didn't want it to stop. "Tell me you want this," Uncle Mark whispered against my lips, his hand sliding up under my shirt, his fingers brushing lightly against my skin. "Tell me." I swallowed hard, my breath coming in shallow gasps as his hand moved higher, tracing a path up my chest. Did I want this? My body certainly did. There was no denying the way I responded to his touch, the way my pulse raced whenever he kissed me. But the conflict inside me was overwhelming, a mix of guilt, fear, and desire that I couldn't untangle. Yet, in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the way he looked at me, the way his touch sent shivers through me, the way his voice made my heart skip a beat. Uncle Mark groaned softly, his grip tightening as he kissed me again, his mouth moving down to my neck, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. The intensity of it all was too much, too fast, but I couldn't stop myself from responding, from arching into his touch, from letting myself get lost in the moment. The line had already been crossed, and now there was no going back. The room felt warmer now, the air heavy with everything we weren't saying, with all the lines we had already crossed. Uncle Mark's hands moved over my skin with a deliberate urgency, like he had been waiting for this for far too long, and now that he had me here, he wasn't going to hold back. I could feel the weight of his body pressing against mine, his warmth enveloping me, and despite the turmoil racing through my mind, my body responded to every touch. His mouth moved lower, trailing heated kisses down my neck, each one sending a shiver through me. I gasped softly, my fingers digging into his shoulders as I tried to keep myself grounded. But it was no use. The sensation of his lips on my skin, the way his hands explored every inch of me, was overwhelming. I was completely and utterly lost in the moment, lost in him. "Uncle Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling as his hands slid up under my shirt, pushing the fabric higher until it bunched around my chest. The heat from his touch made my skin burn, made my heart race, and I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. He pulled back just long enough to lift my shirt over my head, tossing it aside without a second thought. His eyes darkened as he looked down at me, his gaze intense, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Desire? Longing? It didn't matter. All I knew was that I couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "You're perfect," he murmured, his voice thick with something raw and primal, something that made my pulse quicken. His hand moved to my waist, fingers brushing lightly against the bare skin there, and I shuddered under his touch. The way he looked at me, the way his hands moved over me like I was something to be savored, something he had wanted for so long. It was too much, too intense, but I couldn't bring myself to stop it. He leaned down again, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was hungry, demanding, filled with a need that mirrored my own, and I responded in kind, my hands sliding up to tangle in his hair as I pulled him closer. His body pressed against mine, the heat between us growing with every second, and I could feel the hardness of him against me, could feel the way he wanted me just as much as I wanted him. "Tell me you want this," he whispered against my lips, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. His hand slid down to the waistband of my pants, fingers teasing the edge as if he were waiting for permission to go further. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to find my voice. Did I want this? My body was screaming yes, but my mind was still a whirlwind of confusion. This was my uncle. We weren't supposed to be doing this, but the way he touched me, the way his lips moved against mine, made it impossible to think clearly. All I knew was that I didn't want him to stop. "I want you," I whispered, the words escaping my lips before I could stop them. And as soon as they were out, I knew there was no turning back. My hands roamed over his back, feeling the taut muscles beneath his shirt, the way his body tensed and relaxed with every movement. It was like we were both caught in a storm, unable to stop, unable to slow down. My breath hitched, and I arched into it, my body craving more, needing more. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but feel. I gasped softly, my hips arching instinctively as his hand moved with more purpose, sending waves of pleasure racing through me. My mind was a blur, my thoughts scattered, but I didn't care. All that mattered was him, the way he touched me, the way his body felt against mine. "Uncle Mark." My voice was a shaky whisper as his touch intensified, becoming more demanding. I wasn't certain how much longer I could endure this, how long I could maintain my grip. His lips pressed against mine again, hungry and fervent, and I responded with matching passion, my fingers clutching his shirt, pulling him closer, desperate to erase the space between us. The heat radiating between us was scorching, the tension so thick it felt suffocating, yet I couldn't bring myself to want it to end. I craved this. I craved him. This yearning had been buried within me for so long. He murmured against my mouth, his voice raspy with desire, his words sending shivers down my spine, making my heart skip a beat. He had desired this too, all this time. He had been thinking about me, wanting me just as I had secretly yearned for him. The realization quickened my pulse, igniting the already burning desire within me. My thoughts were a blur, my body trembling with need, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold back. But as swiftly as it ignited, the moment shattered. A noise from beyond the door, a faint creak like shifting floorboards, brought us both to a standstill. Uncle Mark recoiled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes darting towards the door. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved, the tension between us replaced by a sudden surge of panic. "What? What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Uncle Mark shook his head, his hand still resting on my waist. But the fire in his eyes had vanished, replaced by something darker, something apprehensive. I don't know. The silence in the room was suffocating, as though the walls were closing in, and the reality of what we had been doing crashed down around me. This was wrong, terribly wrong, and now someone might have heard us, someone might know. The silence that followed felt eternal. My heart hammered in my chest, the fear of discovery consuming me. Uncle Mark's hand lingered on my waist, his touch warm, but the connection between us had altered. The passion from moments ago was now replaced by a chilling fear. Guilt and panic hung heavy in the air. We remained frozen, listening intently for any sound from outside the room. There were no further creaks, no approaching footsteps. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps we were still alone. But the mere possibility that someone might have heard, that someone might know, was enough to shatter the moment completely. Uncle Mark pulled away, his breath coming in short, strained bursts. His hand slipped from my waist, running through his hair, his face etched with conflict. "We can't do this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. This is wrong." His words struck me like a physical blow, and I felt the full weight of what we had done crashing down. It was wrong. We both knew it, yet we had allowed it to happen. The desire, the tension, had overtaken us, clouding our judgment, and now we were left standing in the ruins. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for, getting caught up in the moment, letting things escalate, or for wanting him in the first place. Perhaps it was all of it. Perhaps it was for crossing a line that should have remained uncrossed. Uncle Mark stood up from the bed, pacing back and forth, rubbing his hand over his face as if trying to comprehend what had just transpired. "No, it's not your fault," he said, his voice strained with frustration. "It's mine. I should have stopped. I should have." He trailed off, shaking his head, his eyes filled with regret. The room felt colder now, the intimacy between us completely gone, replaced by a heavy blanket of guilt and confusion. I pulled my shirt back on, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had happened, what this meant for us, for our family. Maybe we should just forget this ever happened," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. The idea of forgetting, of pretending none of this had occurred, felt impossible. But what other option did we have? We couldn't go back. We couldn't undo what had been done. But we could try to move on, try to pretend everything was normal. Uncle Mark stopped pacing, his back to me as he stared at the door. "Yeah," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe that's for the best." We both knew it wasn't true. There was no forgetting this. It would hang between us, unspoken but ever present. No matter how hard we tried to act like everything was normal, this moment would always be there, lurking in the shadows. I stood up from the bed, feeling unsteady and uncertain. I should go," I said, my throat tight. The weight of the situation was suffocating me, and I needed to escape, to breathe, to think. Uncle Mark turned to face me, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might say something, try to stop me. But instead, he just nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Maybe that's a good idea." I didn't say anything more. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, and I needed to get away from the weight of his gaze, the reality of what we had done. I reached for the door, my hand on the knob, but just before opening it, I hesitated. "Uncle Mark," I whispered, glancing back at him. "Do you regret it?" He looked at me, his eyes a mixture of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't know what to think right now." His words hung in the air between us, and I nodded in understanding. I didn't know what to think either. Everything felt too complicated, too overwhelming, and I couldn't make sense of it all. I opened the door, stepping into the hallway, and as I walked down the dimly lit corridor, the weight of what had just happened settled upon me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't something we could simply ignore. It wasn't something we could pretend hadn't occurred. Yet for now, that's precisely what we had to do. The following days passed in a blur. I avoided Uncle Mark as much as possible, spending most of my time away from the house or in my room, attempting to process the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed me since that night. Every time I thought about what had happened, a wave of guilt and shame washed over me. But there was something else there too, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I missed him. Even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew we couldn't be together, a part of me missed the intimacy we had shared that night. It wasn't just the physical connection. There was something deeper, something that transcended the kiss, the touch. It was as if we had opened a door neither of us realized was there, and now that it was open, it was impossible to close. But regardless of how much I missed him, I knew we couldn't go back. We had to move on, had to pretend it never happened, for the sake of our family, for our own sakes. A few days later, Uncle Mark left. He didn't say goodbye. I heard the door close early in the morning, the sound of his car starting up as he drove away. It was a quiet departure, but it felt appropriate. We both knew there was nothing left to say. The house felt empty without him, the silence almost oppressive. I sat on the couch, staring at the spot where he had been just days before, and I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever return to normal. Perhaps they wouldn't. Perhaps that night had irrevocably changed everything. But for now, all I could do was try to forget, even though I didn't want to.